A successful black woman, owner of a private jet, arrives at a private airfield, excited for a long-anticipated trip. But within moments, everything changes. The airport staff, skeptical of her identity, question her ownership of the jet, denying her the right to board. Humiliated and surrounded by onlookers, she makes one phone call. Just 7 minutes later, the staff are scrambling, and what happens next leaves everyone stunned. This is more than a story about a flight, it's about resilience, power, and justice. Stay with me as we uncover the chain of events that shook this private terminal to its core and sent a powerful message about discrimination in spaces of privilege. Before we dive in, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you find this story inspiring, don't forget to subscribe for more impactful tales that demand to be told. The sun dipped low on the horizon, its amber light painting the sleek contours of Margaret Daniels' black SUV as it glided onto the private airfield. The world here was hushed, deliberate, a sanctuary of privilege. The hum of distant jet engines and the muted murmur of ground staff set a rhythm of exclusivity. Margaret adjusted her scarf, a deep crimson that cut sharply against her tailored black blazer, and stepped out with the practiced poise of someone used to walking into rooms she wasn't expected in. The air was crisp, biting with the kind of chill that only the wealthy seem to ignore. Margaret's heels clicked against the tarmac as her driver closed the car door behind her. Each step was deliberate, calculated. Her life had taught her that even the smallest movement in spaces like these could ripple outward. Misinterpreted, misjudged. The private terminal loomed ahead, its glass facade reflecting the fading light. Margaret had flown out of this terminal before, but it always felt the same, polished, sterile, and thick with unspoken rules. Inside, men in tailored suits lingered in quiet clusters, exchanging glances and half-smiles that spoke of deals and inheritances. Women in oversized sunglasses perched on leather chairs, their laughter soft and fleeting, as if to avoid disturbing the delicate air of exclusivity. Margaret approached the marble counter at the far end of the lobby. Behind it, a young receptionist, blonde and impeccably groomed, typed briskly on a keyboard without looking up. "Good afternoon," Margaret said, her voice smooth, unhurried. She placed her ticket confirmation on the counter. "I'm here for Flight 809, Gulfstream to Chicago." The receptionist glanced up, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second. It was a flicker, barely perceptible, but Margaret caught it. It was the look she knew too well, the moment someone recalculated who she was, who she could be, and who they thought she shouldn't be. "Flight 809? The receptionist repeated, her tone hovering between polite confusion and disbelief. "Yes," Margaret said, her voice steady. The receptionist hesitated, then stood, smoothing her skirt. "One moment, please, I'll need to verify this." She disappeared behind a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." Margaret waited. She was used to waiting. Her eyes scanned the terminal, noting the subtle glances from other passengers. An older white man in a navy blazer pretended not to look, his magazine held upside down. A woman with pearls clutched her purse a little tighter as Margaret's gaze drifted her way. The door opened again, and the receptionist returned with a man who moved with the authority of someone who expected no one to question him. His uniform was pristine, his silver hair neatly combed. "Ma'am," he said, his voice clipped, "I'm Captain John Brooks. Is there an issue here?" Margaret suppressed the sigh rising in her throat. She had met men like him before, men who spoke as though every word was a favor. "No issue," Margaret replied, holding up her phone. "I have my confirmation here. I'm booked on Flight 809. Brooks didn't even glance at the screen. His arms folded across his chest, and his smile held a practiced condescension. "I'm afraid that's a private charter. Ma'am, this terminal isn't open to the public." Margaret felt the familiar weight of the moment settle around her. The air thickened. The room seemed to hold its breath. She kept her tone even. "This isn't my first time flying from here, Captain." Brooks's smile faltered for a brief second before returning. "Colder this time. We've had issues in the past. People trying to board flights they aren't cleared for. I'm sure you understand the need for thorough security protocols." Margaret met his gaze without blinking. "And have you confirmed with the booking office?" "It's standard procedure," Brooks said, signaling toward the lounge. "It might take some time. You're welcome to wait over there." The implication hung in the air like a low, distant thunder. Margaret could have argued, Could have reminded him of her credentials. Her investments. The board seat she held in the very company that operated this terminal. But she didn't. She wasn't interested in convincing him of her worth. She slipped her phone back into her handbag and gave him a faint smile. Of course. Margaret moved to a seat by the window. Her back straight, her gaze steady. She had learned long ago that the quiet dignity of restraint could say more than 1,000 words. But beneath her calm exterior, her mind was already moving 2 steps ahead. The hum of jet engines outside was steady, a sound that had always brought her comfort. But now, it felt distant, almost mocking. Across the room, Captain Brooks spoke quietly to another staff member. Their glances toward her were brief but telling. Margaret's phone buzzed softly in her bag. She pulled it out, her fingers moving deftly across the screen. The call was brief. "David," she said when the line connected. Her voice was calm, measured. "I need you at the terminal. Now." She ended the call and leaned back in her seat, her gaze returning to the tarmac. The late afternoon sun was dipping lower now, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. Margaret Daniels had faced shadows before. She knew how to wait. But more importantly, she knew how to endure. Somewhere in the distance, a plane roared to life, its engines climbing in a crescendo that matched the quiet storm building in her chest. Today, Margaret decided, the weight of assumptions and unspoken rules would not go unanswered. As the minutes ticked by, the terminal's quiet luxury began to feel more like a gilded cage. But Margaret's resolve only hardened. She had walked into this room knowing it wasn't built for her. But she would walk out knowing she had redefined its walls. The terminal's quiet hum continued, a melody of muffled conversations, the distant hiss of steaming coffee machines, and the rhythmic tapping of polished shoes against marble floors. Margaret sat by the window, her face serene, though her heart beat in steady rebellion against the unspoken tension that had settled over the room. Outside, the Gulfstream jet gleamed under the sun's fading light, a beacon of her hard-earned success and, at the same time, the reason for this latest test of endurance. She watched Captain Brooks out of the corner of her eye. He stood near the reception counter, his posture rigid, his face set in a mask of professionalism that didn't quite hide the undercurrent of something sharp or disdain. Perhaps, or suspicion. Margaret couldn't hear his words, but his gestures and occasional glances in her direction spoke volumes. She had seen this play before. It was not a drama of overt hostility but one of small, calculated slights. Brooks didn't need to yell or refuse outright. His weapon was delay, and he wielded it with the precision of someone who had practiced this dance many times before. Margaret's phone vibrated softly in her lap. She glanced down. A message from David. 2 minutes away. Her fingers hovered over the screen before replying. "Take your time. I've got this." She slid the phone back into her bag and crossed her legs, her movements measured and deliberate. Across the room, an older couple, a man with a neatly pressed suit and a woman whose pearls shone faintly under the dim lights, stole another glance at her. Their eyes darted away when she met their gaze, but the unease lingered in the air like a heavy perfume. Margaret let out a soft breath and turned her attention back to the jet. She was accustomed to these silent judgments, these whispered questions that never needed to be voiced. Who is she? How does she belong here? The answers were never enough for people who had already decided that she didn't. The door to the terminal opened with a soft chime, and David Harrison stepped in. His presence shifted the energy in the room immediately, like a gust of wind in a too still meadow. Tall, sharply dressed, and unmistakably confident, David moved with the ease of someone who had nothing to prove but was ready to prove everything if necessary. Margaret didn't need to call him over. David's eyes found her instantly, his lips curving into the faintest hint of a knowing smile. But before he approached, he made a deliberate detour straight to Captain Brooks. Margaret leaned back slightly, her hands resting on the armrests of her chair as she watched the scene unfold. Brooks stiffened at David's approach, his shoulders squaring as if bracing for impact. "Captain Brooks," David greeted, extending a hand. His tone was warm, polite, but there was steel beneath it. Brooks hesitated for half a beat too long before shaking David's hand. "Mr. Harrison," he said, his voice tight, "can I help you? I believe you already know why I'm here." David replied smoothly. His eyes didn't waver, didn't blink. "Miss Daniels, one of our shareholders, has been waiting an awfully long time for what should be a routine boarding process. Brooks's jaw tightened, his lips pressing into a thin line. There's been a discrepancy, he said carefully. I was just ensuring all protocols are followed. David's smile didn't falter. I'm quite familiar with protocol, Captain, but it seems to me that this is less about protocol and more about perception. The room seemed to hold its breath. Margaret felt the weight of every pair of eyes turning toward the exchange. Brooks opened his mouth to respond, but David continued before he could. You see, David said, his voice dropping slightly, Miss Daniels is not just any passenger. She's a stakeholder in this operation, so any delay she experiences reflects poorly on the entire company. I'm sure you wouldn't want that, would you? Brooks shifted his weight, his composure cracking just enough for Margaret to see the unease behind his carefully constructed facade. Of course not, he said finally, though the words came out stiff and forced. Good, David said, clapping him lightly on the shoulder. Then I trust you'll resolve this immediately. Brooks nodded curtly and turned on his heel, disappearing toward the reception desk. David crossed the room to Margaret, his smile softening as he approached. Trouble follows you everywhere, doesn't it? He said, his voice low. Margaret smirked. I don't invite it. It just can't seem to resist. David took the seat beside her, leaning in slightly. You handled that well, he said. I didn't handle anything, Margaret replied, her gaze still fixed on the jet outside. You did. David's expression grew serious. It shouldn't take me walking into a room to change the way people treat you. Margaret, that's the problem. She turned to him, her eyes steady. I know, but it's not the first time. And it won't be the last. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps. The receptionist returned, her face pale, followed by Brooks, whose expression was tight with barely concealed irritation. Miss Daniels, Brooks said, his tone clipped. Your flight is ready for boarding. My apologies for the delay. Margaret stood gracefully, smoothing the lines of her blazer. She didn't acknowledge Brooks's apology, didn't give him the satisfaction of her gratitude. Instead, she turned to David, her voice calm but resolute. Shall we? David nodded, falling into step beside her as they made their way toward the jet. But as they climbed the stairs and the cabin door closed behind them, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that the confrontation wasn't over. The tension lingered, an undercurrent that hummed beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Margaret settled into her seat by the window, her reflection faint against the glass. Outside, the tarmac stretched wide and empty, the horizon glowing with the last light of day. The engines roared to life, and as the jet began to taxi down the runway, Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself. She had won this round. But she knew better than to believe the fight was over. It never was. The Gulfstream sliced through the sky with a precision that belied the turbulence inside its cabin. Margaret sat by the window, her posture immaculate, her eyes fixed on the deepening dusk outside. The jet was as silent as it was luxurious. But silence here was not peace. It was the kind of quiet that carried unspoken tensions, like a storm building on the horizon. David, seated across the aisle, was scrolling through his phone. Though Margaret knew he wasn't really reading, his thumb paused every few seconds, his expression tightening. He glanced at her, opened his mouth as if to say something, but then thought better of it. Margaret caught his reflection in the glass, her lips curving into a faint, knowing smile. Say it, she said, her tone low but firm. David sighed, setting his phone down. You know Brooks isn't letting this go, don't you? Margaret's gaze didn't waver from the horizon. He can't. Men like him don't know how. David leaned forward, lowering his voice. You should have let me handle him completely back there. These things, they can escalate. Margaret turned to him, her expression calm but unyielding. And if they do, what happens then? He wins? No, David, I didn't fight my way into these spaces to let people like Brooks decide how long I can stay. Before David could respond, the lead flight attendant appeared, a young woman, barely 30, with a crisp uniform and an expression that tried too hard to convey professionalism. Miss Daniels, she began, her voice steady but tinged with something Margaret couldn't ignore: hesitation. Can I offer you anything? Water? Coffee? Margaret studied her for a moment, then shook her head. No, thank you. The woman nodded quickly and retreated to the galley. But not before Margaret caught the nervous glance she shot toward the cockpit. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Margaret's instincts were sharp, honed by years of navigating spaces where every gesture mattered. "She's scared," Margaret said softly once the attendant disappeared. David frowned. "Scared of what?" "Not what," Margaret replied, her eyes drifting toward the cockpit door. "Who?" The hum of the engine seemed louder now, pressing against the edges of the silence. Margaret felt the shift in the air, a quiet unease that settled into her chest like an unwelcome guest. She leaned back in her seat, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. Minutes passed, the tension growing with every mile the jet climbed. Then, a faint tremor jolted the cabin. It wasn't the turbulence Margaret had experienced on countless flights before. It was deliberate, precise. She sat up straighter, her hand instinctively gripping the edge of her seat. David glanced at her, his brow furrowing. "That didn't feel right." Margaret nodded, her eyes narrowing. "No, it didn't." The cockpit intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're encountering some mild turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The message was calm, routine, but Margaret wasn't convinced. She had learned to listen for the things people didn't say. And Brooks's voice carried something beneath the surface, something calculated. David shook his head, muttering under his breath, "This man doesn't quit." Margaret said nothing, her mind racing. She turned her attention to the galley, where the flight attendant had reappeared, her movements brisk but strained. When their eyes met, the woman hesitated, then quickly averted her gaze. "David," Margaret said quietly, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I need to speak to her." David started to protest, but Margaret's expression silenced him. She rose, steadying herself as the plane dipped slightly, and made her way to the galley. The flight attendant, Rachel, according to her name tag, straightened as Margaret approached, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Miss Daniels," Rachel began, her voice shaky. Margaret raised a hand, stopping her. "Rachel," she said softly, "is there something I need to know?" Rachel hesitated, her eyes darting toward the cockpit door. I don't think I'm supposed to say anything." Margaret stepped closer, her voice firm but gentle. "Rachel, I'm not asking you to break any rules. I'm asking you to tell me if there's a reason I should be concerned." Rachel's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of the moment pulling her down. She glanced around, as if making sure no one else was listening, then leaned in. "It's Captain Brooks," she whispered. "He's been asking questions. About you, why you're flying alone, whether you've been cleared for this flight." Margaret's jaw tightened, but her expression remained calm. "And what did you tell him?" "Nothing," Rachel said quickly, "but he's been in the cockpit with the co-pilot since takeoff." "I don't think this is just about turbulence." Margaret nodded slowly, the pieces falling into place. "Thank you, Rachel," she said quietly. "You've done enough." Rachel hesitated, then whispered, "You should call someone when we land." Margaret met her gaze, her eyes steady. "I already have." Rachel stepped back, disappearing into the galley. Margaret returned to her seat, her mind racing. David leaned forward, his voice low. "What did she say?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. She glanced toward the cockpit, her expression hardening. "Brooks is trying to make a case," she said finally. "He's looking for a reason to turn this into something it's not." David's hands clenched into fists. "This is dangerous, Margaret. He's playing with more than rules now." "I know," Margaret said, her voice calm but firm. "But so am I." The jet dipped again, the cabin shuddering briefly before steadying. Margaret's gaze never left the cockpit door. She had walked into this fight knowing the stakes, and she wasn't about to let fear dictate her next move. Whatever Brooks thought he could prove, Margaret Daniels was ready. This was her sky, too, and she wasn't about to let anyone take it from her. The Gulfstream's cabin was wrapped in a silence so taut it threatened to snap. The low hum of the engines vibrated through the plush leather seats, a reminder of the altitude separating them from the ground below. Margaret Daniels sat rigidly in her seat, her gaze fixed on the cockpit door. She felt the weight of David's eyes on her but didn't turn to meet them. "You're too quiet," David finally said, his voice low but insistent. Margaret tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Quiet doesn't mean still." David leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Margaret, this isn't just about one man's arrogance anymore. He's escalating. You saw what Rachel said. He's looking for an excuse. Any excuse. Margaret's lips tightened. And he won't find one. The intercom crackled again, cutting through the cabin. Brooks's voice followed, its practiced calm failing to mask the edge beneath. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be experiencing some additional turbulence as we navigate an incoming weather pattern. Please remain seated and ensure your seat belts are securely fastened. David's brow furrowed. Weather pattern? The sky's clear. Margaret. It's not weather, she replied, her voice colder now. It's him. The plane jolted, not violently but enough to send the glass of water on her tray quivering. Margaret gripped the armrests, her nails pressing into the soft leather. She had flown enough to recognize the difference between nature's chaos and a deliberate hand at the controls. She turned to David, her voice steady despite the storm building in her chest. I need you to stay calm. Calm? David hissed, his voice rising just enough to betray his frustration. He's testing you, testing us. Margaret met his gaze, her own unwavering. And I intend to pass. The plane steadied for a moment, the silence in the cabin stretching thin. Then Rachel appeared again, her steps hesitant as she approached Margaret. Miss Daniels, she said softly, glancing toward the cockpit. Captain Brooks has asked me to inform you that he'll need to speak with you after we land. Margaret raised an eyebrow, her expression sharp but composed. Did he say why? Rachel hesitated, then shook her head. No, ma'am, but he seemed agitated. David's fists clenched, his knuckles white. This is ridiculous. Margaret held up a hand, silencing him. She turned to Rachel, her voice steady but firm. Thank you, Rachel. You've done enough. Rachel lingered for a moment, her expression torn. Then she nodded and retreated to the galley, her shoulders hunched as though carrying the weight of the moment with her. David exhaled sharply. You're not seriously going to let this man interrogate you? Margaret's gaze didn't waver from the cockpit door. I've handled worse. That's not the point, David snapped, his frustration finally breaking free. You shouldn't have to handle this. Not here, not now. Margaret turned to him, her expression softening but her resolve unshaken. I know, but the fact that I shouldn't have to doesn't mean I won't. The plane dipped again, the jolt sharper this time. Margaret's hands gripped the armrests tighter, her composure slipping just for a moment before she regained it. David muttered something under his breath, then leaned back in his seat, his arms crossed. This isn't over when we land, he said. You know that, right? Margaret nodded faintly. It never is. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane began its descent. Outside, the Chicago skyline glimmered in the distance, its jagged silhouette cutting through the night. The tension in the cabin was palpable now, a living, breathing thing that pressed against Margaret's chest. The intercom buzzed one last time. This is your captain. We'll be landing shortly. Please prepare for arrival. David leaned forward, his voice low but urgent. You have your phone ready? Margaret glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Always. The wheels touched the tarmac with a soft thud, the plane slowing as it taxied toward the private hangar. Margaret could feel the weight of what was coming pressing against her. But she didn't flinch. As the jet came to a stop, Rachel reappeared, her face pale. She opened the cabin door, the staircase descending with a soft hiss. Cold air swept into the cabin, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the jet's interior. Margaret stood, smoothing the lines of her blazer. She retrieved her handbag with a practiced grace, her movements deliberate. David rose beside her, his expression tense. Let me go first, he said. Margaret shook her head. No, this is my fight. She stepped onto the staircase, the cold air biting against her skin as she descended. Brooks was waiting at the bottom, his stance rigid, his clipboard clutched tightly in his hands. Miss Daniels, he said, his tone courteous but cold. There's been a discrepancy with your flight details. I'll need to discuss this with you before you leave the terminal. Margaret stopped in front of him, her chin lifted, her gaze steady. A discrepancy? She said, her voice smooth but laced with steel. Or a problem you created? Brooks stiffened, his lips pressing into a thin line. I'm simply following protocol. There's that word again, Margaret said, her tone sharp. Protocol. Funny how it always seems to appear when someone like me enters a room. Brooks's eyes flickered, a flash of something unspoken passing between them. Margaret stepped closer, her voice dropping just enough for only him to hear. You think you can rattle me? Captain? That you can make me small enough to fit into the box you've built for me? She smiled faintly, her eyes cold. You've already lost. Margaret turned and walked past him, her heels clicking against the concrete. David was waiting by the car, the engine idling quietly. As she climbed into the backseat, Margaret glanced over her shoulder one last time. Brooks stood at the bottom of the staircase, his clipboard hanging limply at his side, his face pale with the realization that he had underestimated her. David closed the car door behind her, sliding into the driver's seat. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. You didn't give him much to hold on to, did you? He said. Margaret's gaze drifted to the city lights beyond the hangar. He doesn't need much, she said softly. Men like him always find a way to hold on to ghosts. The car pulled away, the hangar fading into the distance. Margaret Daniels sat in the backseat, her expression calm but her resolve unshaken. She had won this battle. But the war was far from over. It never was. The car glided through Chicago's streets, the city lights casting fleeting patterns across Margaret's face. Her gaze remained fixed on the window, where the blur of urban life played like a restless film. David, ever attentive, stole glances at her through the rearview mirror, his expression a mixture of concern and admiration. What now? He asked, his voice breaking the silence but careful not to disturb her thoughts. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She allowed the question to linger in the air, her reflection in the glass unflinching. The city outside was alive, pulsating with energy, but to her, it felt distant, almost irrelevant. We wait, she finally said, her tone deliberate, and we see how much noise Brooks is willing to make. David let out a dry laugh, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. Noise is all men like him know how to make. Margaret's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. Then let him. A man who shouts rarely realizes how clearly he reveals himself. The car turned into an underground parking garage, its walls cold and industrial. David parked near the elevator and cut the engine, the sudden silence filling the space like a held breath. Margaret stepped out, her heels clicking against the concrete, each step echoing with purpose. The elevator ride to her office was quiet, save for the soft hum of machinery. Margaret stood poised, her hands clasped in front of her, while David leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. You know he's going to try to twist this, David said, his tone sharper now. Margaret glanced at him, her expression calm but firm. Let him try. The elevator chimed, its doors sliding open to reveal a sleek, modern office space. Clara, her assistant, was already waiting, her expression tense but professional. Miss Daniels, Clara began, falling into step beside her. You've received multiple messages since your landing. The board wants to convene an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. Tomorrow? Margaret asked, her voice steady but edged with curiosity. What about tonight? Clara hesitated. They didn't want to disturb you after your flight. Margaret allowed herself a small, knowing smile. How considerate of them. She stopped at the door to her office and turned to Clara. Make the arrangements. I want every board member in that meeting. No exceptions. Clara nodded and disappeared down the hall. David followed Margaret into her office, where the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the city. You think they're nervous? David asked, leaning against her desk. They're not nervous yet, Margaret replied, setting her handbag down with a deliberate motion. But they will be. She sank into the chair behind her desk, her fingers lacing together as she stared out at the city. The silence stretched between them, heavy but unspoken, until David broke it. What's the play, Margaret? Because Brooks isn't going to slink away quietly. Men like him never do. Margaret's eyes remained on the horizon, her voice calm but laced with steel. The play is the same as it's always been, the truth. And the truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be heard. David frowned, his frustration bubbling to the surface. But what if they don't want to hear it? What if they decide that his noise is easier to live with than your silence? Margaret finally turned to him, her gaze piercing. Then they'll learn that my silence isn't submission. It's strategy. Before David could respond, Clara reappeared at the door, her expression urgent. Miss Daniels, there's been a development. Margaret stood, her posture instantly alert. Go on. Clara glanced at David, then back at Margaret. Captain Brooks has filed a formal complaint with the board. He's claiming that you used your position to circumvent security protocols and disrupt operations." David cursed under his breath, pushing off the desk. "That lying." Margaret raised a hand, silencing him. Her expression didn't falter, but the fire in her eyes burned brighter now. "What else?" Clara hesitated. "He's also accusing you of being unfit to represent the company's interests, citing your behavior during the flight." David's jaw tightened. "Behavior? You barely said a word to him." Margaret exhaled slowly, the weight of the accusation settling over her. But instead of anger, a calm resolve took its place. "Good," she said softly, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. David blinked. "Good? How is this good?" Margaret stepped around the desk, her movements deliberate, because now he's shown his hand. "And tomorrow, we'll remind him and the board who built this house they're so comfortable living in." The next morning came quickly, the hours slipping by in a blur of preparation and quiet determination. Margaret arrived at the boardroom early, her presence commanding even in the empty space. The polished table, the leather chairs, the city skyline framed by the windows, everything in this room was designed to project power. And Margaret Daniels had every intention of reclaiming it. One by one, the board members filed in, their expressions ranging from neutral to apprehensive. Harrison, the CEO, entered last, his face carefully composed but his eyes betraying his unease. "Margaret," he greeted, taking his seat at the head of the table. "Thank you for coming." Margaret didn't bother to respond. She waited until everyone was seated, the room settling into an expectant silence. Then, she rose, her gaze sweeping over the faces of those who held her fate in their hands. "Let's begin," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The battle was far from over. But Margaret Daniels was ready. She had faced rooms like this before, filled with people who underestimated her, who doubted her place at the table. But Margaret didn't need their approval to take her seat. She only needed their attention. And she had it now. The boardroom was heavy with an air that could not be named but was undeniably present. The polished table reflected fragments of the skyline, its towering peaks like silent witnesses to the unfolding drama. Margaret Daniels sat with her back straight, her eyes steady, while the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was a room where decisions were made, where power was negotiated, and where people like her had historically been unwelcome. But Margaret had not come to negotiate. Harrison, the CEO, cleared his throat, the sound breaking the uneasy silence. "Margaret," he began, his voice measured, "I understand there's been some tension regarding your flight yesterday." Margaret tilted her head slightly, a faint smile touching her lips. Tension is an interesting word for it. Across the table, one of the older board members, a man with graying hair and an expression that seemed carved from stone, interjected. "Captain Brooks has filed a formal complaint," he said, his tone clipped. "He claims you disrupted operations and overstepped your authority as a shareholder." Margaret let the words hang in the air for a moment. Unblinking, she could feel the eyes of the room on her, some curious, others wary. "And did he provide evidence of this alleged disruption?" she asked calmly. The man hesitated, his gaze flickering toward Harrison, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "He cited your behavior as unprofessional and confrontational." The man continued, his voice faltering under Margaret's unwavering stare. Margaret leaned forward, her hands resting lightly on the table. "Unprofessional, confrontational. Interesting choice of words, wouldn't you say?" Harrison raised a hand, his expression conciliatory. "Margaret, this isn't an attack. We're just trying to understand what happened." Margaret's smile disappeared, her gaze sharpening. "No, Harrison, this is an attack, but it's not about what happened on that flight. It's about what my presence represents." The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing against the air like a storm cloud. Margaret stood, her movements deliberate, her voice steady but rising with the intensity of the moment. "Captain Brooks didn't file that complaint because I disrupted operations. He filed it because I disrupted his perception of who belongs in spaces like this, spaces he believes should remain untouched by people like me." A murmur rippled through the room. But Margaret didn't pause. Her gaze swept over the board members, her words cutting through their silence like a blade. "Let's not pretend this is about protocols or procedures. This is about power, who wields it, who gets to benefit from it, and who is expected to remain on the outside looking in." Harrison opened his mouth to speak, But Margaret silenced him with a raised hand. "I built my career navigating rooms like this," she continued, her voice growing steadier with each word. "Rooms where my presence is questioned before I've even spoken. Rooms where I'm measured against expectations I never agreed to. And yet, here I am, not because you allowed it, but because I earned it." David, seated near the door, leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable but his pride evident in the subtle nod he gave her. Margaret turned her attention back to Harrison. "You want to know what happened on that flight? I'll tell you. Captain Brooks saw me, a black woman, boarding a plane he didn't believe I should own, much less step foot on. He questioned my credentials, my authority, my very presence, and when he couldn't find a valid reason to deny me, he created one." The silence in the room was deafening now. The unspoken truths Margaret had voiced hanging like smoke. Harrison shifted in his seat, his expression tight. "Margaret, I understand your frustration." "No," Margaret interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "You don't understand, but you should, because this isn't just about me. It's about every person who has ever been told they don't belong in spaces like this. Not because of their abilities, but because of their identity." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the room. "This company has a choice to make. It can either stand with those who perpetuate these systems of exclusion, or it can become a leader in dismantling them. But make no mistake, your decision here will set a precedent far beyond this boardroom." Harrison exchanged a glance with the older board member, who now looked distinctly uncomfortable. The room buzzed with unspoken tension, the kind that Margaret had felt in her bones since childhood. Finally, Harrison exhaled and leaned forward. "Margaret, what do you propose?" Margaret allowed herself a brief moment of silence, her expression softening just slightly. "First, Captain Brooks resigns. Immediately. His actions are a liability. Not just to me, but to the company's reputation. Second, we conduct a thorough review of our internal culture, from hiring practices to how we handle incidents like this. And third," she paused, her gaze locking on Harrison, "we make it clear that this company values diversity not as a talking point, but as a foundational principle." The room was still, the weight of her demands settling over the table like a verdict. Harrison nodded slowly, his expression resigned but resolute. "We'll convene a meeting to discuss the next steps." "No," Margaret said firmly, "we've already had enough meetings. Now, it's time to act." The older board member cleared his throat, his voice unsteady. "You're asking us to make significant changes. Margaret, these things take time." Margaret turned to him, her voice sharp but measured. "Time is a luxury afforded to those who aren't suffering the consequences of inaction. For people like me, time has always been a weapon, wielded to delay progress and maintain the status quo. I won't wait any longer. And neither should this company." The man looked away, his silence speaking louder than any argument. Harrison sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Fine, we'll start with Brooks. I'll handle it personally." Margaret nodded, her expression unchanging. "Good, because this isn't just about what's right. It's about what's necessary." As the meeting adjourned, the board members filed out, their footsteps echoing in the quiet room. David lingered near the door, waiting for Margaret. When the last member had left, he crossed the room to her, his smile faint but proud. "You didn't just hold your ground," he said, "you moved the whole damn mountain." Margaret allowed herself a small smile, her gaze drifting to the skyline. "It's not about the mountain, David, it's about the view on the other side." The city stretched before them, vast and unyielding, and for the first time that day, Margaret allowed herself to breathe. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had shifted, and Margaret Daniels had no intention of letting it turn back. The morning after the board meeting dawned gray and heavy, the kind of sky that mirrored Margaret Daniels' mood. She sat at her kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling beside her, untouched. Her phone buzzed intermittently, the messages piling up faster than she could read them. News of Captain Brooks's resignation had traveled quickly, setting off ripples within the company and beyond. David had called earlier, his voice filled with a mix of triumph and caution. "They're watching you now, Margaret," he had said, more closely than ever. "You made them move a piece they didn't want to touch." Margaret's response had been measured. "Let them watch. They've been doing it my whole life." But even as she spoke those words, she felt the weight of the moment pressing against her. This wasn't just about Brooks, or the board, or even her seat at the table. It was about the cracks beneath the surface fault lines that ran through the foundation of the company. The industry, and the society it served. She had exposed one, but there were countless others, hidden and waiting to be unearthed. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Rising, she crossed the room and opened it to find Clara standing there. Her face pale and drawn. "Miss Daniels," Clara began, her voice tight. "You need to see this." Clara handed Margaret her tablet, the screen already glowing with a news headline. Whistleblower claims toxic work culture at aviation firm following resignation of Captain Brooks. Margaret's heart sank as she scanned the article. The whistleblower, unnamed but clearly someone with insider knowledge, had alleged widespread discrimination and bias within the company. Pointing to Brooks's actions as just the tip of the iceberg, Margaret set the tablet down, her fingers tightening into fists. She had anticipated backlash, but this was different. This was a storm brewing on a scale she hadn't expected. "Who else knows?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with steel. Clara hesitated. "The board is already meeting to discuss it. Harrison called an emergency session. He's asking for you to join." Margaret nodded, her mind already racing. "Tell him I'll be there." The boardroom was a different beast that afternoon. The tension from the day before had not dissipated, it had thickened, wrapping itself around the air like smoke. Harrison sat at the head of the table, his usual composure strained. "Margaret," he greeted as she entered. His tone clipped. "Thank you for coming." Margaret took her seat, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the board members. Some looked at her with wary respect, others avoided her eyes altogether. "We have a situation," Harrison began, his voice heavy. "The allegations in this article, they're serious. If we don't get ahead of this, it could destroy everything we've built." "Everything we've built?" Margaret repeated, her tone sharp. "Or everything you've maintained by ignoring the cracks in the system?" Harrison flinched but didn't respond. Another board member, a woman in her 50s with a steely expression, spoke up. "Margaret, no one is denying that changes need to be made. But this article is a disaster. If we don't manage the narrative, it could ruin our reputation." Margaret's gaze narrowed. "The truth isn't a narrative to be managed. It's a foundation to be rebuilt. And if our reputation can't survive the truth, then it was never worth protecting in the first place." The room erupted into murmurs, some in agreement, others in dissent. Harrison raised a hand to quiet them, his expression tight. "What do you propose we do, Margaret?" he asked, his tone edged with frustration. "We can't dismantle the entire company overnight." "No," Margaret said, her voice rising with conviction. "But we can start by addressing the culture that allowed this to happen. Publicly, transparently. If we try to sweep this under the rug, it'll only grow." Another board member shook his head. "You're asking us to air our dirty laundry in front of the world. Do you know what that will cost us?" Margaret's gaze hardened. "What it will cost you is less than what it's already cost the people who've suffered under this culture. You're worried about the bottom line. I'm worried about the people who've been crushed beneath it." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Harrison exhaled slowly, his hands steepled in front of him. "All right," he said finally. "We'll issue a statement acknowledging the allegations and committing to an independent investigation." "But Margaret," he leaned forward, his eyes sharp, "you need to understand the risk you're taking here. This could backfire." Margaret met his gaze without flinching. "The only risk I care about is failing to do what's right." The statement was released that evening, its language carefully crafted but unflinchingly honest. It acknowledged the whistleblower's claims, outlined steps for an independent review, and reaffirmed the company's commitment to equity and accountability. The backlash was immediate. Social media exploded with reactions, some praising the transparency, others condemning the company for its alleged failures. Former employees came forward with their own stories, adding fuel to the fire. Margaret watched it all unfold from her office, her phone buzzing incessantly with calls and messages. David stood by the window, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "They're going to come for you," he said finally, his voice low. "Not just the board, but the people who want things to stay the way they are." Margaret leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. "Let them. They've been coming for me my whole life." David turned to her, his eyes filled with something between admiration and fear. "You're not afraid, are you?" Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile. "I'm always afraid, David, but fear has never stopped me before." And it won't stop me now. The night stretched on, the city glowing beneath the weight of the storm she had unleashed. Margaret Daniels knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But she also knew this: she had already survived the impossible. And she wasn't done yet. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Margaret Daniels' office, casting long shadows across the polished wood floor. It was a deceptive calm, the kind of stillness that comes before the chaos truly begins. Margaret stood by the window, her arms crossed, her gaze distant as the city below stirred to life. Her mind was elsewhere, cycling through the events of the last 48 hours, the resignation, the whistleblower's revelations, and the statement that had ignited both praise and fury in equal measure. David's voice pulled her back to the present. "You're all over the news," he said, holding up his phone. "Some are calling you a hero. Others, well, not so much." Margaret turned, her face unreadable. "And what do the others say?" David's expression hardened. "That you're overstepping. That you're turning this into a personal crusade. Some are even questioning your motives, whether this is about justice or just making a name for yourself." Margaret allowed herself a small, humorless laugh. "Of course they are. When a black woman stands her ground, it's always about her ego, never the truth she's defending." David leaned against the edge of her desk, his eyes fixed on her. "They're scared, Margaret. You've forced them to look in the mirror. And they don't like what they see." Margaret nodded, her gaze steady. "Good. Fear is where change begins." Before David could respond, Clara appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "Miss Daniels, there's a press conference scheduled outside the building. Protesters, reporters, some employees, too." Margaret's brow furrowed. "Employees?" Clara nodded. "A mix of former and current staff. Some are supporting you, others, not so much." David cursed under his breath. "This is exactly what we didn't need." Margaret shook her head. "No, this is exactly what we did need. The truth out in the open, where it can't be ignored." The plaza outside the building was a hive of activity. Cameras flashed, reporters jostled for position, and voices rose in a cacophony of chants and questions. Some signs bore messages of solidarity, accountability now, and "Stand with Margaret Daniels." Others were less kind. "Stop the witch hunt," and "Margaret Daniels must go." Margaret stepped out of the building, her heels clicking against the stone steps, the sound cutting through the din. The crowd quieted, a collective breath held as she approached the podium set up near the entrance. David and Clara flanked her, their presence a silent show of support. She surveyed the crowd, her expression calm but resolute. This was not the first time she had stood before a room or a mob that questioned her right to be there. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying over the crowd. "I've come here today because I believe in confronting challenges directly, no matter how uncomfortable they may be." Her gaze swept over the faces before her, some supportive, others hostile. The allegations brought to light over the past few days are not new. They are not surprising, and they are not unique to this company. They are the symptoms of a culture that has long prioritized power over people, and exclusion over equity. A murmur rippled through the crowd. But Margaret pressed on. "I understand that some of you feel this is an attack on the company, on its leadership, or even on its employees. But let me be clear. The only thing under attack is the complacency that has allowed injustice to thrive unchecked." A reporter raised a hand, her voice cutting through the air. "Miss Daniels, how do you respond to those who say you're jeopardizing the company's future by exposing these issues publicly?" Margaret met the woman's gaze without flinching. "The future of any organization should be built on truth, not silence. If acknowledging wrongdoing jeopardizes this company's future, then that future was never secure to begin with." The crowd stirred again, voices rising in a mixture of agreement and dissent. Another voice called out, this time from an employee standing among the protesters. "And what about the rest of us? The ones who've worked here for years without issue? Are you saying we're part of the problem?" Margaret turned toward the man, her tone softening but losing none of its strength. "I'm saying that silence is complicity. If you've worked here for years and never noticed a problem, it's time to ask yourself why. Who were you not seeing? Whose voices were you not hearing?" The man looked away, his expression tightening. Margaret straightened, her voice rising above the tension. "This moment is not about blame. It's about responsibility. Responsibility to acknowledge the harm that has been done and the courage to ensure it doesn't happen again. A small but growing ripple of applause began in the back of the crowd. Spreading like wildfire, Margaret felt the shift, the tide beginning to turn, though she knew it was far from over. Back inside the building, the mood was quieter but no less charged. Clara handed Margaret a folder filled with updates from the investigation, her expression tight. "More stories are coming in," she said. "Employees who were too afraid to speak up before. They're naming names, detailing patterns of behavior. It's a lot." Margaret flipped through the pages, each testimony a heavy weight. "Good," she said finally. "This is how we begin to dismantle it." David, standing by the window, turned to face her. "You know this isn't just a company issue anymore. The press is treating you like a lightning rod. People either want to rally behind you or tear you down." Margaret met his gaze, her expression resolute. "Let them try. I didn't come this far to stop now." David nodded, his admiration clear. "You've started something bigger than you realize." Margaret set the folder down, her hands steady. "No, David, I know exactly how big this is. And I'm ready for it." The city outside buzzed with the energy of a fight that had just begun. Its outcome uncertain but its stakes undeniable. Margaret Daniels had stepped into the light, and she had no intention of stepping back. This was not just a reckoning. It was a revolution, and Margaret was prepared to see it through to the end. The tension in the air was electric as Margaret Daniels walked into the boardroom, her heels clicking against the polished floor with deliberate rhythm. The members were already seated, their faces tense, their conversations hushed. This was no ordinary meeting, this was a reckoning. And everyone in the room knew it. Harrison, seated at the head of the table, cleared his throat as Margaret entered. "Margaret," he said, his voice attempting calm but betraying the cracks beneath. "Thank you for joining us. We have pressing matters to discuss." Margaret slid into her chair, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "I'm aware," she said simply. She had spent the morning reading through the latest wave of employee testimonies, each one a painful reminder of the culture she was now tasked with dismantling. Stories of bias and exclusion, whispered warnings, and silent complicity filled page after page. It wasn't new, but seeing it laid bare was still a gut punch. "The press is escalating," Harrison continued, leaning forward, "and so are the whistleblowers. The allegations are growing, and some of them implicate senior members of this board." A murmur swept through the room. Margaret didn't flinch. She had expected this. It's one thing to acknowledge the company's failings. Margaret, one of the board members, a man in his 60s, said, "But this is turning into a witch hunt. If we start taking down senior leadership, where does it end?" Margaret turned to him, her gaze steady. "It ends where it should have begun, with accountability." The man bristled, but Margaret didn't give him time to respond. "You're worried about how far this will go. You should be worried about what happens if it doesn't go far enough," she said, her voice sharp but even. "Every name in these testimonies represents a life impacted by the choices we've made or failed to make. This isn't a witch hunt. It's justice." Harrison sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Justice is one thing, Margaret, but we have to consider the survival of the company. If we lose too many senior leaders, the company doesn't survive on their leadership alone." Margaret interrupted, her tone cutting through his. "It survives on the trust of its people, trust we've already shattered. Repairing that trust means making hard choices, not convenient ones." Another board member, a woman with a sharp demeanor, leaned forward. "And what if these hard choices cost us our most valuable assets?" Margaret's eyes narrowed. "If those assets are the ones perpetuating this culture, they were never valuable. They were liabilities." The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone present. Outside the boardroom, the atmosphere was just as charged. Employees gathered in clusters, their whispers barely contained. Clara had been fielding calls all morning, her normally composed demeanor showing signs of strain. David found Margaret in her office later that afternoon, his expression grim. "It's getting messy out there," he said, closing the door behind him. "It was always going to," Margaret replied, not looking up from the stack of papers on her desk. David sat across from her, his hands folded. "You're making enemies, Margaret, not just on the board, but among the employees, too. Some are saying you're going too far." Margaret finally looked at him, her eyes unwavering. "And what do you think?" David hesitated, then shook his head. I think you're doing exactly what needs to be done. But that doesn't make it any less dangerous. Margaret leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. Change is always dangerous, David. That's why so many people avoid it. A knock at the door interrupted them. Clara stepped in, her expression tight. Margaret, you need to see this. She handed Margaret a tablet, the screen glowing with another news headline. Former executive accuses Margaret Daniels of hostile takeover agenda. Margaret scanned the article, her jaw tightening. The former executive, a man who had been quietly dismissed years ago for misconduct, was painting her efforts as a power grab, a personal vendetta under the guise of reform. David swore under his breath. They're trying to discredit you. Margaret set the tablet down, her expression cold. Let them try. Clara hesitated. It's gaining traction. Margaret, people are questioning your motives. Margaret stood, her movements deliberate. Then it's time to remind them what this is really about. By the time Margaret reached the employee assembly that afternoon, the tension in the air had reached a boiling point. The auditorium was packed, the hum of voices loud and insistent. As she stepped onto the stage, the room quieted, all eyes turning to her. Margaret stood at the podium, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. I know why you're here, she began, her voice steady but rising with conviction. You've heard the accusations, the stories, the speculation, and you're wondering what to believe. She paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. This isn't about me, she said firmly. It's about us, all of us. It's about the culture we've allowed to grow unchecked, the harm it's caused, and the responsibility we have to fix it. A murmur rippled through the crowd. But Margaret pressed on. Change is uncomfortable. It's messy. And yes, it's dangerous. But the greater danger is doing nothing, pretending we don't see the cracks because it's easier to look away. Her voice rose, the fire in her eyes igniting. We cannot look away anymore. Not if we want to be better. Not if we want to be more than the sum of our mistakes. The room was silent now. The tension replaced by something else, something quieter but no less powerful. Margaret leaned forward, her voice softening but losing none of its intensity. I know some of you are afraid. I am, too. But fear is not our enemy. Complacency is, and I refuse to let it win. The applause started slowly, scattered, but it grew quickly, filling the room with a thunderous roar. Margaret stood tall, her resolve unshaken, as the sound washed over her. This wasn't just a fight anymore. It was a movement, and Margaret Daniels was ready to lead it, no matter how high the stakes. The day was gray and overcast, the kind of sky that seemed to press down on the city, suffocating it under its weight. Margaret Daniels stood at the edge of her office window, staring out at the city she had fought so hard to make her mark on. The distant sounds of life, honking horns, the faint chatter of voices were muted, as though the world itself had taken a step back to watch what would happen next. Inside the building, the tension was palpable. The fallout from the allegations and Margaret's public stance had reached a boiling point. Employees whispered in hallways, their eyes darting toward closed doors. Emails pinged back and forth between board members and senior leadership, their tone growing increasingly frantic. Margaret turned away from the window and sat at her desk, her hands resting on the smooth wood. Clara entered moments later, a file in her hand, her face tight with concern. Miss Daniels, she began, setting the file down. This is the final report from the independent investigation. It's extensive. Margaret opened the file, her eyes scanning the pages. Each line was a dagger, more stories of bias, harassment, and exclusion. Some names she recognized, others she didn't, but all carried the same weight. Clara hesitated before speaking again. The board has called another emergency meeting. They're demanding answers. Margaret looked up, her expression unreadable. Good, so am I. The boardroom was more crowded than usual, with additional chairs brought in to accommodate senior leaders and external consultants. The air was thick with anticipation. Every conversation hushed, every glance laden with tension. Margaret entered the room with the report in hand, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. The chatter ceased as she took her seat, her presence commanding the room without a single word. Harrison cleared his throat, his face lined with stress. Margaret, thank you for joining us. We've reviewed the preliminary findings of the investigation, and it's concerning. Concerning? Margaret repeated, her voice steady but sharp. That's an understatement, Harrison. These findings are damning. The older board member who had opposed her before spoke up. His tone defensive. We've all made mistakes, Margaret, but this report paints a picture that doesn't reflect the company we've built. Margaret turned to him, her gaze piercing. Doesn't reflect the company you've built? Or the company you've chosen to ignore? The room fell silent, the weight of her accusation pressing down like a heavy fog. This report doesn't exaggerate the problem, Margaret continued, her voice rising with conviction. It reveals it, and pretending it's not there won't make it disappear. It will only make us complicit. Harrison sighed, leaning forward. What do you suggest we do? Margaret, we can't undo the past. No, Margaret agreed, but we can change the future. And it starts with accountability. She placed the report on the table. Her movements deliberate. The people named in this report must face consequences. No exceptions. And we need to commit to systemic changes policies. Training. Oversight to ensure this doesn't happen again. The sharp board member leaned forward, his voice cutting. And what about you, Margaret? Some would say your actions have divided this company more than united it. Margaret's gaze didn't waver. Unity without justice is an illusion. If my actions have divided this company, it's because they've forced us to confront a truth we've been avoiding for too long. The room buzzed with murmurs. But Margaret didn't stop. You asked me what I suggest, she said, her voice steady but rising in intensity. I suggest we stop treating this as a PR problem and start treating it as a moral imperative. Because if we fail to act, we don't just lose the trust of our employees, we lose our humanity. Harrison nodded slowly, his expression resigned but thoughtful. You're asking for sweeping changes, Margaret, changes that won't be easy. Margaret leaned forward, her gaze sharp. Change is never easy, Harrison, but it's necessary, and if we don't do it now, we might not get another chance. Outside the boardroom, the atmosphere was charged. Employees gathered near their desks, their conversations hushed but urgent. News of the meeting had spread, and everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. David met Margaret in the hallway after the meeting, his expression a mixture of pride and concern. You didn't hold back in there, he said. Margaret shook her head. There's no time to hold back. David, this is bigger than me or them. David nodded, his voice lowering. The press is still circling. And some of the names in that report, they're powerful people. Margaret, they're not going to go down without a fight. Margaret's eyes hardened. Let them fight. I didn't come this far to stop now. That evening, Margaret stood on the rooftop of her building. The city sprawled out before her. The wind was cold, biting against her skin, but she didn't move. She was replaying the day's events in her mind. Every word spoken, every decision made. Clara joined her, holding a tablet. The media's already picking up the story, she said. Some are praising the company's transparency. Others, not so much. Margaret took the tablet, scrolling through the headlines. There were words of support, but also harsh criticisms, accusations of betrayal, of overreach. She set it down, her gaze returning to the skyline. Do you ever wonder, Clara asked softly, if it's worth it, all of this? Margaret didn't answer immediately. She closed her eyes, letting the wind carry her thoughts. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. It's not about wondering if it's worth it, she said. It's about knowing that it has to be done, no matter the cost. Clara nodded, her admiration evident. You're doing something extraordinary, Margaret. Margaret turned to her, a faint smile on her lips. Extraordinary isn't the goal, Clara. Justice is. As the night deepened, Margaret stood alone on the rooftop, the city lights flickering like distant stars. She knew the battles ahead would be harder, the opposition fiercer, but she also knew this. She was ready. The breaking point had come, and Margaret Daniels was prepared to rebuild from the ashes. The next morning brought no peace, only a deeper sense of urgency. The sky hung low, gray and heavy, casting a muted glow over the city. Margaret Daniels sat at her desk, staring at the latest barrage of emails and headlines. The company was now the epicenter of a storm, every allegation, every decision amplified and scrutinized by the public. David burst into her office without knocking, his face a mix of frustration and alarm. It's worse than we thought, he said, throwing a stack of papers onto her desk. Margaret picked them up, her brows furrowing as she skimmed the pages. The contents were damning: leaked memos, internal emails, and testimonies from former employees painting a picture of systemic bias and negligence. "Where did this come from?" she asked, her voice calm but sharp. "An anonymous source," David replied, "but it's everywhere now. Every major outlet is running with it. And the board is panicking." Margaret leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. "Let them panic. They should have been panicking years ago." David shook his head. "This isn't just about them anymore. Margaret, this is about you. They're framing you as the face of all of this, as if you're the one who created the problem, not the one trying to fix it." Margaret's jaw tightened. "Of course they are. It's easier to blame the person shining the light than to confront what's in the shadows." The board convened that afternoon, the atmosphere even more charged than before. The tension was thick, the air electric with unspoken accusations and rising fears. Margaret entered the room to find Harrison already seated, his face drawn and pale. "Margaret," he began, his tone weary, "we're in uncharted waters here. The company's reputation is hanging by a thread. The shareholders are demanding action." Margaret took her seat, her gaze steady. "What kind of action, Harrison? The kind that protects the people responsible? Or the kind that actually creates change?" Harrison sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "This isn't about protecting anyone. It's about survival. If we don't control this narrative, the company might not survive at all." A younger board member, one who had remained quiet in previous meetings, finally spoke up. "And what about the employees, Margaret? The ones who say you've gone too far? That you're tearing this place apart? Do their voices not matter?" Margaret turned to him, her voice calm but firm. "Their voices matter. All voices matter. But unity without accountability is just complicity in disguise. If we want to build something better, we have to be willing to dismantle what's broken." The room buzzed with murmurs. But Margaret pressed on. "This company is at a tipping point," she continued, her voice rising. "We can either cling to a version of ourselves that's comfortable but untrue, or we can confront the hard truths and become something stronger. The choice is ours, but make no mistake, there is no middle ground." Harrison leaned forward, his voice low but urgent. "And what if that choice means sacrificing everything we've built?" Margaret met his gaze without flinching. "Then it's not worth saving." Outside the boardroom, the protests had grown louder. Employees, former staff, and activists gathered in the plaza, their chants echoing off the glass walls of the building. Some carried signs of support for Margaret, justice for all, while others accused her of dividing the company. "Margaret Daniels must go." Clara found Margaret in her office, her face etched with worry. "There's a reporter downstairs," she said. "They're asking for a statement. They want to know what you plan to do next." Margaret stood, her movements deliberate. "Then let's tell them." The press conference was impromptu. A hastily assembled podium set up in front of the building. Cameras flashed as Margaret approached, her figure framed against the backdrop of the city. She stood tall, her expression calm but resolute. "I know there are many questions," she began, her voice carrying over the crowd. "Questions about what's happening within this company, about my role in it, and about what comes next. I'm here to answer them." She paused, letting the murmurs quiet before continuing. "Let me be clear. The problems we're facing are not new. They are not sudden. They are the result of years, decades of complacency, of silence, of turning a blind eye. And that silence ends now." A reporter called out, "Miss Daniels, some say your actions are dividing the company. What do you say to those accusations?" Margaret's gaze didn't waver. "Division is not my goal. Truth is. And sometimes, the truth divides before it unites. But if we want unity, we must first build it on a foundation of justice, not denial." Another voice rose from the crowd. "Do you believe this company can recover?" Margaret took a moment before answering. "Recovery is not about returning to what was. It's about creating something new, something better. And that's what we're committed to doing, no matter how difficult it may be." The applause started slowly but grew, a wave of support that spread through the crowd. Margaret stood firm, her resolve unshaken, even as she knew the hardest battles were still to come. That night, as the city settled into its quiet rhythm, Margaret sat in her office, the glow of the skyline reflecting in the window. David entered, his expression thoughtful. "You were incredible today," he said, sitting across from her. Margaret smiled faintly. "Today was just one step, David. There's still so much more to do." David nodded. "But you've shown them what's possible. That's more than most ever do. Margaret turned to face him. Her gaze steady. Possibility is only the beginning. Now, we have to make it real. The city hummed around them. A living, breathing testament to resilience and struggle. And as Margaret looked out at the lights, she knew she was ready for whatever came next. This was the tipping point, and she would not let it pass in vain. The boardroom was quieter than it had been in weeks. But the silence wasn't peace, it was the calm before a decision that would ripple far beyond the walls of the building. Margaret Daniels sat at the head of the table, her gaze steady, her hands resting lightly on the polished wood. The sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the room and the people in it with an unrelenting clarity. Every board member was present, their faces tense. The findings of the independent investigation had been released to the public the night before. A decision Margaret had pushed for against the objections of many in the room. The report detailed not just individual failings but a culture of systemic bias that stretched back decades. It was a damning portrait, but it was also a blueprint for change. Harrison cleared his throat, breaking the stillness. "Margaret," he began, his voice measured but strained. "The shareholders are demanding answers. They want assurances that this company will survive economically and reputationally." Margaret leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "Survival isn't the goal, Harrison. Transformation is." A murmur rippled through the room. One of the older board members, his voice sharp with skepticism, spoke up. "Transformation is all well and good, Margaret, but let's not pretend this isn't a business. If we alienate the wrong people, our investors, our clients, this company won't have the resources to transform anything." Margaret met his gaze without flinching. "If we continue as we have, it won't matter how much money we have. We'll lose the trust of the people who make this company what it is, our employees, our customers, and the public." The room was silent again, the tension thick. Margaret stood, her movements deliberate. "We've reached a point where we can no longer choose comfort over courage. The report has shown us the depth of the problem. Now, we must decide whether we have the will to fix it." She turned to the group, her voice rising with conviction. "This isn't just about policies or training programs. It's about dismantling a culture that has allowed injustice to thrive. That means making real changes starting with the leadership." Harrison shifted uncomfortably. "You're suggesting more resignations?" "I'm suggesting accountability," Margaret said. "The people who perpetuated this culture cannot be the ones to rebuild it. That includes members of this board." The room erupted into murmurs, some voices rising in protest. "You're asking us to dismantle ourselves," one member said, his tone incredulous. "I'm asking you to do what's right." Margaret shot back. "If you're unwilling to do that, then yes, you should step aside." The meeting stretched into hours, every word a battle. Some board members pushed back, their arguments laced with fear and self-preservation. Others began to waver, the weight of the evidence and Margaret's resolve breaking through their defenses. By the time the meeting adjourned, the decisions made were historic. Several senior leaders, including 2 board members, announced their resignations, effective immediately. The company committed to a sweeping overhaul of its hiring and promotion practices, mandatory training programs, and the creation of an independent oversight committee. As the room emptied, Harrison lingered, his face lined with exhaustion. "You've won, Margaret," he said quietly. Margaret shook her head. "This isn't a victory, Harrison. It's a beginning." Outside the building, the energy was palpable. Reporters swarmed the plaza, their cameras flashing, their voices overlapping as they shouted questions. Employees gathered in small groups, some watching the chaos with quiet apprehension, others discussing the changes with cautious optimism. Margaret stepped out into the sunlight, the weight of the day pressing against her shoulders. Clara and David stood nearby, their expressions a mix of pride and concern. "You did it," David said, his voice low. Margaret gave a faint smile. "We did something. The rest is still to come." As she made her way through the crowd, a reporter managed to get close enough to ask, "Miss Daniels, how does it feel to have forced this company to change?" Margaret paused, turning to face the reporter. It wasn't about forcing anything. It was about holding up a mirror and asking everyone to look. Change doesn't come from one person, it comes from many, working together, refusing to accept the way things have always been. That evening, Margaret returned to her office, the city glowing softly in the twilight. She stood at the window, her reflection superimposed against the skyline. The fight wasn't over, she knew that. The changes announced today would take years to implement fully, and resistance would come in waves. But for the first time, Margaret felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: hope. David entered the room, a glass of wine in his hand. He handed it to her, his expression lighter than it had been in weeks. "To justice," he said. Margaret took the glass, her lips curving into a small smile. "To persistence." They clinked their glasses together, the sound ringing softly in the quiet room. As the night deepened, Margaret Daniels sat in the glow of the city, ready for whatever came next. She had faced the storm and stood her ground. Now, it was time to build something better, something that would last. For the first time in a long time, the dawn of change felt real, and Margaret was ready to see it through.